Research group of Public Citizen. With me is Dr. Sid Wolfe, the founder of our group, senior advisor for the Health Research Group. George Annis, a professor of law, bioethics and human rights at Boston University. Alice Drager, professor of clinical and medical humanities bioethics at the School of Medicine at Northwestern University. And we have two families with us whose children were enrolled in the support study. We have Carrie Pratt, Sean Pratt, and their daughter Dagan. And this is Charissa Cook.
That's my baby.
Who had whose son was enrolled at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. So each of us going to make just a few brief comments.
And plenty of time for questions.
So, as you've heard, the support study was a very complex experiment in which these infants were exposed to multiple experimental procedures that involved serious risks of harm, and those risks of harm, including death, weren't disclosed to the parents when they enrolled their children. OHRP, the Office of Human Resource Protections, earlier this year issued a letter stating that was the case, and that has caused a tremendous backlash, and some of that backlash you're hearing today. Many of the consent forms included very misleading statements, like, because all the treatments proposed in this study are standard of care, there are no predictable increased risks for your baby. That is just simply misleading and untrue. And because of these types of consent deficiencies, the parents who enrolled their babies in this trial were deprived of the opportunity to provide informed consent for the research, and that fundamentally made the research unethical. NIH and HHS have refused every time to acknowledge any failure in the consent process. They continue to argue that yes, this was all standard of care, and that simply is not true. The parents of the support study deserve an apology, and they deserve to be told what actually happened in this experiment. And I'm going to let Dr. Wolfe follow up with some additional comments.
One way which we have characterized the problem that precipitated this meeting today, the meeting should never have occurred because it's a meeting based on an attack by NIH and some of its researchers on the criticism of their studies. And the conflict boils down to, I think, one thing, not very simple, but it's one thing. Is this standard of care, usual care, individualized care, or is it research? And what has happened is that by not informing patients adequately about what was going on, many of the patients thought that it was individualized care, that was standard of care. As Mike started to say, none of these consent forms mentioned the risk of death from low oxygen. Over half of them said you're getting the standard of care in each group, the high oxygen and the low oxygen group. And in addition to that, in terms of the risks, over half of them said because all the treatments proposed in the study are standard of care, no predictable increase in risk. So, given that that's what the informed consent sheet said here, what about the reason I mentioned New Zealand this morning is that somehow based on the same data, same experiment, the New Zealand experiment with respect to oxygen was identical to what was going on there. But what did they tell them in New Zealand? They said, quote, too low oxygen in the blood for long periods may increase the risk the baby will not survive or contribute to poor growth and damage the brain cells and lead to developmental problems. And then they told the parents the purpose of the study. The aim of this study was to determine within the range of oxygen saturations now being used, the standard, actually 85 to 95, whether the low end of this range compared to the upper end of the range, 85 to 89 versus 91, 95, is safe and effective in reducing serious vision, retinopathy, prematurity, and lung problems without increasing death or neurodevelopmental disability. So in New Zealand, they were capable of telling people what was really going on. You heard this morning that part of this was because the consent form was derived in conjunction with parents. So if parents are involved, they want to find out something. So what we're threatened with here, because the attacks have been really vicious to the point where explicitly many of these investigators have said OHRP should retract the letter, should retract the criticisms. So we think that rather than lessening the standard, weakening things, there should be an increased surveillance based on what has happened in in the support study and in other studies, such as the TOP study, the transfusion study that we criticized last week. To weaken the standards would be to sacrifice critical informed consent dependent autonomy of patients. I mean, part of informed consent is the patients have the autonomy to decide whether or not to participate in the study, and instead defer to researchers' autonomy, the researchers' autonomy to conduct trials with questionably ethical design, that was not focused on so much this morning, and unquestionably unethical consent forms. The next speakers will be Carrie and Sean Pratt, who were just introduced to you. They were denied the autonomy when they were asked to participate to make an informed decision about participating in the support study. They did participate. They're accompanied by their 6-year-old daughter, Dagan, now 6. And